Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming. This is the first talk of the series, so it means a lot that all of you have showed up, and it's a really heartwarming start to what Mohammed and I have put together. Um, Welcome to the first HTC Forum lecture this year. My name is Fahad Zubairi, and I am a PhD student in History, Theory, and Criticism of Art and Architecture program here at MIT. Together with my colleague Mohammad Fatah, I am the co-chair for the HTC Forum lecture series for this year, 2025-26. This is also the 50th year for the department. Yes. And this is the 50th year of when architects actually started looking more widely and going taking other things in consideration except for form, which had always been the center of architectural history. So before introducing our speaker this evening, we want to take a moment to recognize that the land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag nation, as we acknowledge the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. Secondly, we want to thank the Department of Architecture and the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture here at MIT for supporting this evening's event. We also want to highlight the generous support of Tom Beischer and the Liebstadt Stieber Fund, which helps to make HTC Forum lecture series possible year after year. So HTC Forum is a student-run platform which we curate lectures every year, and two students every year sort of pitch in their ideas and they pick up the mantle of curating these. We have four speakers for this year, and the basic concept of that Mohammed and I had in mind was let's go and sort of investigate some of the fundamentals, the ground on which architectural history stands. So we have Ashish today, and we are starting at probably one of the best places. We are starting this investigation with archaeology. We have Bisera coming, who's our second speaker, who will be talking about acoustics, about sound in buildings. Then we have Ziad Fahmi in the spring semester. He'll be talking about broadcast and street sounds as a way of writing urban histories. And then we have Bill Rankin, who will be talking about cartography as drawing as the method of investigation. So I would now like to invite TNU Yang to introduce our speaker for this evening.
Hello. I don't know if this is actually on. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Yang. I'm a first-year PhD student at HTC currently. And thank you so much, Fahad, for involving us in introducing the speakers. So today I'll introduce Ashish Avikunthak. He's an Indian avant-garde filmmaker, film theorist, archaeologist, and cultural anthropologist. His films have been the subject of more than a dozen retrospectives, 18 solo shows, and they have been shown worldwide in major film festivals, group shows, museums, etc. He has been named Future Greats in 2014 by Art Review. In 2025, this year, he received the Ground Glass Award from Prismatic Ground, the New York-based Festival of Experimental Documentary Avant-Garde Film, in recognition of his outstanding contribution to the field of experimental media. He's the author of Bureaucratic Archaeology, State, Science, and Past in Postcolonial India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. This book ethnographically interrogates the role of Archaeological Survey of India in the making of the past in contemporary India. His scholarly work have been published in the Journal of Social Archaeology, Journal of Material Culture, Contributions to India Sociology, and the India Economic and Social History Review, among other publications. He has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Stanford University and earlier taught at Yale. Currently, he's a professor of film media at Harrington School of Communications, University of Rhode Island. We're honored to have him here today for the first forum, HTC Forum of 2025 to 2026 lecture series. This lecture is co-sponsored, as Fahad mentioned earlier, by the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT. So Ashish will speak for around 45 minutes and followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. So please hold your questions for the end and join me in welcoming him to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Fahad, for inviting me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I am a filmmaker mostly, but this work that I'm going to talk about predates my filmmaking career almost by a few months, I would say. This work that I'm going to talk about deals with the state of archaeology in contemporary post-colonial India, and is basically based on this book that I wrote, which was a product of my PhD work. But it is a work that I have been obsessing for nearly 25 years. And like for most South Asian, archaeology and history is so deeply intertwined with our existence that we engage with it since our school years. What I'm going to start with is I'm going to speak a bit from my book, just to give you a sense of what I do. But before that, I want to start with an image that I want to show all of you. So, yeah. Should I do it from here? If you look at this image closely, this image has been circulating in the Indian social media landscape, especially within Hindu right-wing ecology for nearly a decade. This is now highly circulative image that we see on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook almost every day. As you can see, on top is one of the most iconic architectural monument of India, the Taj Mahal, which I'm sure all of you know. Below it is a Hindu site. Now, this image is how Hindu right wing imagines ancient India today. Below every Muslim mosque, there is a probable hidden temple. Now, the only problem is that in most cases, this is false. I ended up doing my work about such a landscape in the context of archaeology when in 1992, the Babri Mosque in India was demolished, primarily because of an imagination like this, that there was a mosque and below the mosque was a temple. Now, I'm just going to read certain sections. So what I'm going to start with is a couple of paragraphs from the preface of the book, which in a certain sense will give you why I got involved in this work. 6th of December 1992 was an exuberantly bright day in Bombay. Winter had arrived calmly. Sultry, humid weather had given way to a pleasant, cool climate. I was working since dawn at Chaityabhumi. This is a site in Bombay, which was a memorial of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who is the person who wrote the Constitution of India, located at the edge of Arabian Sea in Bombay. It was the 36th death anniversary of Ambedkar, the principal architect of Indian Constitution, and particularly a revered leader of the Dalits, the lowest of the oppressive Hindu caste hierarchy. Like every year, a few 100,000 devoted pilgrims gathered to pay the respect to the departed leader at the site where his last rites were conducted in 1956. The leafy middle-class neighborhood of Dadar, which is this locality, was bustling with multitudes that had journeyed overnight in train, buses, and even by foot from neighboring districts in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Andhra Pradesh. It was late afternoon. I was cautiously negotiating the massive crowd along with Dalit activists, assisting visitors, providing information about restroom, food stall, and trains and bus station. Unexpectedly, an associate of mine nervously rushed towards me through the teeming masses. He aggressively pushed through the crowd and scurried close to me, gasping for breath. His face was contorted with fearful anxiety. He frantically announced, "Babri Masjid has been demolished." They tore it down. It happened a couple of hours ago. By the time all activists regrouped, the enormous gathering was diminishing rapidly. The festive spirit that was stirring the energetic assembly had abruptly diffused. We sensed a palpable tension in the air. Those of us who were following the buildup of the Hindu fundamentalist and North Indian pilgrim town of Ayodhya over the past few weeks were outraged. Not even in our wildest dream did we think that the government of India would allow the destruction of the disputed mosque. By late evening, news of communal violence erupting in different parts of the country started pouring in. At midnight, rioting began in Bombay. Muslim establishment and shops on Lamington Road in south central Bombay, where my hostel was located, was systematically targeted, ransacked, and looted. By morning of December 7th, riots had spread to different parts of the city. Bombay was burning. In the next few days, the most widespread communal violence since the partition of India broke out throughout the country. Savage violence rocked Bombay in two cycles, the first from December 6 to December 12, 1992, and the second from January 6 to January 20, 1993. I saw the city scorched in front of my eyes. More than 1,000 people were killed in these communal riots. Bombay changed. India changed. I changed forever. So the reason I wanted to start with this section is that this work that I did is deeply located within my own biography. I come from a family, my grandfather and my father from both sides of my family belonged to partition. They were refugees who came from what is now Pakistan into East India. So the stories of riots, communal violence, was something that I've heard from my parents since I was a kid. So in 1992, I was about 20 years old when this happened. In Bombay, when this happened, where I was studying, it really, what should I say, broke me down in a way that gave birth to this project. Babri Masjid was located in the early historic city of Ayodhya. Now, in most of North India, which we call the Gangetic plains of North India, is fundamentally, and we know this with more than 100 years of archaeological work, is what we call a multi-religious, multicultural site. We have few hundred sites have been excavated over the last 100 to 150 years, and we know very well that these locations, these sites are not single religious centers, but they were multi-religious, multicultural centers over the course of few thousand years. And Ayodhya, where Babri Masjid was located, is one such site. The Babri Masjid was located in the early historic city of Ayodhya. The Archaeological Survey of India, which is the statist organization that excavates in India, excavated there in 1976 and 1977, and they also excavated a little later. During those excavations, nothing in those excavations reports, which were very small reports that were published, told us that there was a mosque, there was a temple under the mosque. It is subsequently, with the birth of right-wing Hindu movement in the late 80s, that a fraudulent narrative, what you would call a fake narrative, emerged within archaeological discourse, supported by the Archaeological Survey of India, or by some of the key archaeologists working with the Archaeological Survey of India, very forcefully pushing for a fraudulent narrative that there was a temple under the mosque. When the violence happened, archaeology suddenly became at the center of Indian discourse till the excavation of the disputed site of Ayodhya in 2003. By 2003, I had, in these 10 years, from 1992, about which I just spoke, and 2003, nearly 10 years, I had done my master's in archaeology, and then I had moved to Stanford to do my PhD. And the work I did, which is this book, is an ethnography, a very detailed ethnography of how knowledge about past in India is constructed. And I ended up working on the biggest producer of such knowledge in India, which is the Archaeological Survey of India. By this time, I had done my master's. I was a PhD student at Stanford. I was able to infiltrate the bureaucratic structures of the Archaeological Survey of India, and I did a very close ethnography of how the archaeologists of Archaeological Survey of India excavate, how they choose what they decide to excavate, how they excavate, what they excavate, and finally, how they produce the narrative of the objects that they have discovered. So my book is fundamentally an ethnographic trajectory that looks at these basic questions. So I'm just going to read a few things, what I'm trying to do in a much more academic, or what I've done in my work in a much more academic way, just to give you a sense. Bureaucratic archaeology is an ethnographic investigation of the Archaeological Survey of India's micropolitics of epistemic practice. So it's a very, very minute study of how knowledge is produced. In this book, I try to show how empirical archaeological evidence produced by Archaeological Survey of India in Harappan sites. Now, this is another element that I have to kind of unpack. Most of you have heard of the Indus Valley civilization, right? It's one of the big Bronze Age civilization. And it is also one of the most important sites in South Asia that has been excavated for the last 100 years. The Archaeological Survey of India has been excavating a number of Harappan sites. The term we technically use is Harappan. We don't use the term Indus site anymore. We don't call it the Indus Valley anymore. We call it Harappan civilization because the first site in which this civilization was discovered was the site of Harappa, which is a small village in now Pakistan. So the term we use, technical term we use is Harappan site, Harappan. So most of my ethnography was done in the Harappan sites. The reason I decided to work on Harappan site is I could not get access to work at Ayodhya when the excavation was happening, because the excavation of Ayodhya was a juridical excavation, and the system did not allow an outsider like me to work. So I decided to do an ethnography of other sites in India, specifically the Harappan sites, which is another very epistemologically fraught location, and I can speak about that at length. So, so I'm looking at, the work I do in this book is to study how knowledge is produced at these Harappan sites. And the reason I do it because epistemologically, these are homologous to those sites, the knowledge, the way it is used by the highest court in Indian judiciary to adjudicate the presence of a temple under the mosque. It's a similar kind of knowledge producing process. The archaeological practice of ASI has been questioned, debated, and disputed in the quagmire of Indian public sphere. My book steps into this contested world and provides a critical, theoretically nuanced, empirically rich insight into making meaning about past in contemporary India. It's an anthropological investigation of archaeology as a bureaucratic practice in times of science, religion, and politics. I meticulously follow archaeological material culture discovered in the ASI trenches to its transformation into empirical facts published in statist reports and employed as official evidence in courts. The journey from excavated materiality to published epistemology I show in my book is mediated by complex conjunction of scientific and bureaucratic practices of post-colonial state negotiating the institutional bureaucratic world of ASI, which is fraught with a troubled colonial legacy, a turgid governmental machinery, and an entrenched disenchantment amongst its rank and file. Through this ethnographic project, I lay open the social, cultural, and the scientific universe of post-colonial archaeologists and demonstrate the impact of bureaucratic ontologies on epistemological practices. The focal point of my ethnographic lens is the ASI excavation, this key site where the knowledge is produced. It is this epistemic location that scientific practice, bureaucratic rationality, conjoins to produce post-colonial archaeology. It is at the excavation site that material artifacts of past are discovered, excavated, organized, qualified, labeled, catalogued, represented, and produced as object of scientific discourse. Employing everyday micro-practices at the excavation site as the modality of ethnographic investigation, I show that the epistemology of archaeology in India is a product of post-colonial bureaucratic rationality where science, state, and religion are ingeniously contrived to manufacture a nation with a seemingly empirical past. The meaning-making of past, I argue in my book, is not an embodiment of a practice carried out by unyielding bureaucracy acutely entrenched in the culture of a hegemonic state, but it is also the product of a disciplinary discourse of archaeology that has an ambivalent relationship with materiality and epistemology. I try to answer a few fundamental questions in my book. How does Archaeological Survey of India do archaeology? How does Archaeological Survey of India manufacture data, evidence, and facts about Indian past? What kind of technique, methodology, and practices it employs? What are the sociological, political, and ideological process of its ideological production, of its knowledge production mechanism? And most scrupulously, this book investigates how does ASI conducts excavation. How does it discover artifacts in trench? How are artifacts manufactured and transformed into facts? Or to put it very succinctly, this book investigates how Archaeological Survey of India acts in the making of artifacts into facts. So what I've tried, and this is generally my book statement, what I try to do in this book is to show how a bureaucratic organization like the ASI works to produce facts. Facts that could be interpreted with images like this, fraudulent images like this. So my book has it's a very vast terrain I'm trying to cover. I did an ethnography from 2003 to 2005, so nearly about 20 years ago. But it took me about another 4 years to write my ethnography, and then it took me about 10 years later, 10, 15 years later to publish this work. There was a reason why the delay happened. The delay happened, and one of them is that most of my informants were very, very for me to publish the book because it would hamper their career at the ASI. So I eventually published this book in 2021. Although the investigation, the ethnographic investigation I undertake, I think are still valid because the process through which the Archaeological Survey of India produces knowledge is nearly about 7 to 80 years old, its methodology. And it still continues to follow the same way. So I'm going to read a little bit more just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do. Just going to get a little water. Now, why is ASI important in the context of postcolonial bureaucracy or the nature of postcolonial India? I write, ASI is an emblematic organization in this book, imbricated in the institutional practices of postcolonial state. There are many reasons that motivated me to conduct this ethnographic work at the ASI. ASI is not just one of the oldest archaeological bureaucracy in the world, but it is also one of the largest of its kind and has an enormous control over archaeological heritage in India. Unlike other parts of the world, Indian laws do not allow private cultural resource management organization to conduct archaeological excavation in India, thus making ASI hegemonic compared to underfunded university departments and marginalized state archaeological departments. These are the smaller state departments. Also, ASI bureaucratic archaeologists are distinct from archaeologists working in university settings in India because of the significant status authority they wield. ASI's dominance in archaeological knowledge production in India has legal validity, and this is very important. The reports that the ASI produce have a semi-juridical validity in Indian laws. And they also have objective sanctity because they are a statist machinery. By a series of legislation dated to the late 19th century, ASI was given the custodianship of archaeological heritage in India. It is illegal to excavate any site in India without a license issued by the Director General of the ASI. Over the course of a century and a half, it has created a huge archive of knowledge about Indian past, far surpassing any archaeological organization in South Asia. It also has jurisdiction over a huge collection of artifacts and material culture discovered and excavated since its inception. Thus, the ASI has an insurmountable hegemonic authority over the archaeological heritage of India. No other statist or non-statist actors can overrule its influence. In these circumstances, ASI becomes a potent site to study the intersection of archaeology, postcolonial state, modern science, and bureaucracy. There is an indistinguishable ideological commensurability between bureaucracy and science, both being archetypical, rational, predominantly technocratic, historically modernistic, fetishizing efficacy, and emphasizing objectivity. The epistemic community of ASI archaeology is both scientists and bureaucrats at the same time. It is this aggregation of bureaucratic and scientific knowledge production apparatus that makes it a fertile site to investigate the nature of science and state. So my book in particularly examines everyday practices of the ASI bureaucracy at the archaeological site to focus what in anthropology Bourdieu has called theory of practice. of regulation, control, management in micro setting, with the emphasis on investigating the technologies and the assemblages of the post-colonial state, with an interrogation of the operations of material, agents, and technique by ASI to put these bureaucratic rationalities into practices. My aim in this book is to examine the ontology of bureaucratic archaeology in all its specificity, rather than providing a general theory of state or archaeology. At the Archaeological Survey of India, the discursive authority of archaeology's disciplinary assertion do not derive merely from scientific method of its practice, nor does it derive from interpretative nature of its knowledge construction process. Neither archaeology in ASI is a practice susceptible merely to political and nationalistic insinuation. Instead, my fundamental argument in the book is that archaeology itself is an ideological and a cultural knowledge production practice. The theoretical and methodological framework between the construction of evidence and its interpretative creation of knowledge are not incommensurable. This dissimilarity presents a retroactive perspective on the process of archaeological knowledge production. It is the epistemic logic of archaeology and the social and cultural practice of its science that makes it vulnerable to statist and nationalist appropriation in ASI. In the vast, dusty, and desolate fringes of Western India, I realize that the ASI archaeology was a colonial epistemology, reinforced by contemporary science and fortified by post-colonial bureaucracy. Empiricism here is compromised 3 times. First, by an oppressive disciplinary apparatus. Second, by an ideological discursive methodology of practice. And finally, by a stratified post-colonial hierarchy. I show in this book how bureaucracy apprehends discourse of archaeological practice to construct a discourse of Indian past. And I argue that past for ASI is a bureaucratic artifice rather than a scientific artifact. So this is generally to give you a sense of my theoretical framework that I do in the book, my theoretical framework of the project. Subsequently, what I try to show in the book, I get into the history of archaeology in India, which is highly fraught. And this is a good symptom of that fraughtness. And then majority of my book is a very detailed observational ethnography of daily practices of what archaeologists do in these really desolate and dusty sites in Western India. And eventually, the knowledge that are produced in these sites, how they are transformed into facts, which then are used in the courts. So I now then want to get into the situation of Ayodhya and the demolition of Babri Masjid. I just want to read certain section. First, to give you a sense of how these kinds of images, what are the political, historical validity of these images? How are these images produced and circulated in Indian social sphere? Now, the reason this image is also very interesting is that 3 days from today, on 31st of October, a film, a Bollywood film is going to be released. It's called The Taj Story. It's a very big budget Bollywood film, which will see a theatrical release on Friday, the 31st of October, which is basically going to justify this image, which is basically going to try to prove why this image is actually the truth, where this is very far away from anything we know of. And I just want to talk about, in this context, with the rise of what I call Hindutva archaeology. Hindutva is a term used for right-wing Hindu fundamentalist ideology. And in India, over the last 40 to 50 years, there has been a rise of archaeologists deeply believing in this ideology. So I just want to give a little sense of what this kind of archaeology means and how it is transforming the heritage landscape in India. I'm just wondering, where should I start from? Okay. In the early years of post-colonial India, Hindutva ideologues primarily linked Hindu nationalism to history, with archaeology playing a minor role in the discourse. But this connection between Hindutva archaeology and between Hindutva ideology and archaeology can be traced back to a project that started in 1952 by an Indian archaeologist called B.B. Lal, with a project called the Archaeology of Mahabharat Site. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the great Indian epic Mahabharat. And in 1950, B.B. Lal, who is probably could be argued as the father of Hindutva archaeology, started a project where he wanted to search for archaeological evidence for an epic of the epic Mahabharat. B.B. Lal was a prominent archaeologist who began his career with Sir Mortimer Wheeler, a renowned archaeologist who was the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India after independence, who was the last Director General of Archaeological Survey of India before the independence. And B.B. Lal was one of his students. And the basic idea of the Mahabharat site project was to search for artifacts which showed that the great war of Mahabharat had happened. Now, unlike the 19th century excavation by Alexander Cunningham, so there is a tradition in Indian archaeology of looking into literary text and then going into terrestrial location to do archaeological excavation. It started during colonial times by the first Director General of ASI, Alexander Cunningham, who would look for sites mentioned in the Chinese tribal literature, and he started excavating Buddhist sites. And it is in a similar tradition that Lal decided to, B.B. Lal decided to look for sites in the Mahabharata. However, it failed. He was not able to find anything substantial, but it opened up this process, this methodology that there could be a possibility of searching for, of finding empirical material evidences about a literary narrative. A literary narrative which undoubtedly has an extraordinary religious value in contemporary India and has had a very strong, important religious value for most of Hindu understanding of religiosity, but to look for material evidences on the basis of a religious text was something that B.B. Lal started in the 1950s. However, this project did not reach any scholarly value, and B.B. Lal moved from this project. But about 20 years later, he then again got involved with a project which had a deep implication from the nature of Indian archaeology, because that was directly related to Ayodhya and Babri Masjid. After nearly 2 decades of hiatus, a new project emerged in 1970s aimed at providing archaeological evidence for events described in Ramayana, which is another formidable religious text in India, a major epic of ancient India. The archaeology of the Ramayana project was a collaborative effort with ASI and a couple of other institutions led by B.B. Lal. This project involved excavation at Ayodhya and few other sites between 1975 and 1980. Ayodhya had been earlier excavated, revealing, like most North Indian sites in Gangetic Plains, a multicultural site with the earliest layers dated to around the 7th to the 2nd century BCE and going up till contemporary times. And most of North Indian sites in the Gangetic Plains have a similar material cultural trajectory. B.B. Lal's team conducted 3 excavations in Ayodhya in 75, 76, 76, 77, and 79, 80. But only brief reports were published, official reports were published by the ASI. These excavations confirmed that Ayodhya was first settled around 7th century BCE, and the most significant finding that Lal found were Roman rouleted ware, dated to about 1st to 2nd century, suggesting that Ayodhya did see some kind of intercontinental trade with the Roman world. However, but most importantly, there was no mention of a Hindu site under a mosque in this particular report, in the early report. The epistemic rationale for this project was to harness the objective authority of archaeology to validate the historicity of Hindu epics and highlight the empirical nature of Indian Sanskritic past. It was in this epistemological conflation with the discursive legitimacy of scientific archaeology and the possible factuality of Hindu epic tradition that finally made Hindutva ideologue attentive to the political instrumentality of archaeology in India. The potential to transform religious Sanskritic literary world into an empirical reality grounded in India's geographic territory justified archaeology's role in the growing influence of postcolonial Hindutva ideology. Although these projects were not originally conceived within the Hindutva framework, they were co-opted in the 1980s by the rise of Hindutva politics, leading to the eventual demolition of Babri Masjid and its violent aftermath. The archaeology of Ayodhya became a focal point in Indian politics after 1986, when Babri Masjid was unlocked, allowing Hindu worshippers to enter after 37 years. The narrative that Mughal Emperor Babur had demolished an ancient temple marking Ram's birthplace to build a mosque at the same location became the political tool for Hindutva forces. The call to demolish Babri Masjid became their rallying cry. Alongside this, other historical disputed structure like Gyanvapi Mosque in Varanasi, Jama Masjid in Mathura, both allegedly built after demolishing Hindu temples, were scrutinized by political movement led by BJP and the VHP, which is the Hindu right wing. And what you see in this image that I'm showing is a trajectory that begins from the Hindutva narrative that emerges in 1980s. In 1990s, nearly a decade after B.B. Lal had excavated Ayodhya, he claimed in an influential article in Hindu propaganda magazine that he had actually discovered temple pillar bases during excavation, which by all accounts seems completely fake. By endorsing this claim, B.B. Lal thrusted archaeology into the heart of the most significant political debate in postcolonial India. This marked the culmination of Hindutva effort to appropriate the discursive legitimacy of archaeology to advance its decisive politics, reaching its peak on December 6, 1992. When the ASI was summoned by the Lucknow bench of the Allahabad High Court in 2003 to excavate the site, it was taken by the surprise. So ASI was completely surprised, the archaeologists, that they have been asked by the court to excavate the disputed site. In 2003, Ayodhya excavation was the most unusual excavation in a 142-year history of the organization. Court's order to conduct an archaeological excavation to uncover the remains of a Hindu deity beneath the mosque was a peculiar task that the ASI was hesitant to undertake. The High Court directive jolted ASI, which has been relatively obscure bureaucratic entity within the Indian federal government, thrusting it into the midst of one of the most distressing events in post-colonial Indian history since the communal violence of 1947. The special full bench of the Allahabad High Court in Lucknow resorted to a disciplinary framework of archaeology to resolve a case with a significant political implication. The Ayodhya excavation was a massive bureaucratic endeavor, and I write at length about why the excavation itself was so deeply flawed. For one, among many flaws, what was very, very interesting that a 2-volume report of more than 574 pages was completed in merely 10 days. Generally, archaeological reports take about from few months to few years to write. Generally, archaeological reports in Archaeological Survey of India would take a decade or more to write. The Ayodhya report was written in just merely 10 days, which itself is a massive anomaly, among other things. So I'll just directly come, because for the short of time, I'll just directly come to what the Supreme Court in 2019 upheld, why they upheld. The claim of a grand structure resembling a Hindu temple found in an uncredited chapter of the unpublished report from a methodologically flawed archaeological excavation by the ASI under restrictive condition was adopted by the Supreme Court of India. And it concluded that a temple existed under Babri Masjid. It is noteworthy that this chapter was also used by the High Court and the Supreme Court. Now, there are historical and archaeological records suggesting that numerous medieval Hindu and Buddhist sacred sites were plundered and destroyed during 800 years of Muslim occupation in South Asia. And we do have a lot of archaeological and historical records. However, and this is something very important, however, in many cases, empirically proving such a destruction is very, very challenging. The archaeology of early and medieval North India is highly complex. Many ancient settlements in the Gangetic Plains have sprawling archaeological material culture. These sites often exhibit, and this is something very fundamentally complex, these sites often exhibit interconnecting layers of Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu material culture that occurred simultaneously, making it very difficult for archaeologists to separate them without tangible structural or artifactual evidence. With the emergence of Islamic archaeological layer, although a clear chronological break is found, but proving whether pre-Islamic structures were destroyed or reused in the making of Muslim monument becomes extremely difficult. The ruination of monuments, temples, settlement structure is not uncommon in South Asian history, as in any part of the world. Similarly, construction of new monuments over ruined, degraded, or abandoned structure is also a well-established practice. While there is a limited evidence of reuse of abandoned material culture remains like pillars and other material artifacts in the construction of Hindu, Jains, and Buddhist sites, many medieval Muslim sites in North India did refurbish discarded non-Islamic architectural elements to build new monuments. And we have a number of such examples throughout North India. This kind of anomaly, although the Supreme Court adjudicated that there's a temple under the mosque, but they admitted that this kind of anomaly, this kind of anomaly was also noted by the Supreme Court in their Ayodhya judgment, and this is something very important. They firmly stated that the 400-year gap between the 12th century underlying structure and the 16th century Babri Mosque was too long a time period to make for a case of deliberate destruction by the Muslim. They importantly asserted that ASI excavation failed to show demolition of the temple to construct a mosque. And this is very important. However, these kinds of images still proliferate and have almost been treated as facts today. I'm just going to end with what is happening in today as we speak. As the mob of Hindu fundamentalists closed in on the besieged medieval monument on the fateful day of 6 December 1992 in Babri Masjid, a multitude of slogans and war cries reverberated throughout the alleyways of the religious city. Among those, one slogan unmistakably foreshadowed a future yet to unfold. And I'm going to first read it in Hindi, what they said. Ayodhya to bas jhanki hai, Kashi Mathura baki hai. Ayodhya is just a glimpse. Kashi and Mathura are still left. Kashi and Mathura were the two other disputed sites which have now become part of the contemporary discourse on destruction. And Taj Mahal is emblematic of this image is emblematic of this kind of imagination, that under some of the most important mosques in North India, there is a temple hidden. This ominous declaration pointed towards two other prominent archaeological sites in India, Kashi, also known as Varanasi, and Mathura, where similar disputes over religious structure exist. In these places, Hindu fundamentalists aim to dismantle mosques supposedly built by Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb after demolition of Hindu temples, an ongoing narrative of contestation and conflict. I'm just going to end with the last paragraph. In the viral ecosystem of social media, archaeological and historical nuances are either ignored or completely expunged. Hindutva handles frequently enumerate such sites, numbering to thousands scattered throughout India. These listings lack empirical substantiation, relying instead on imagined history, mythological narratives, blatant falsehood, fabricated accounts, all disseminated within the epistemological murkiness of social media universe. Within this narrative of misinformation, history and archaeology assume pivotal role in challenging the ontological essence of monuments while constructing a formulaic meta-narrative of Muslim aggression. Now, even the historical validity of iconic sites such as Taj Mahal has been called into question by the Hindutva forces. Thank you. Very happy to take questions.
Yeah, we'll open the floor for questions, and I hope you have lots of them. But we'll try to accommodate as many as possible.
See, Caroline Jones is not here, so. Thank you. A very moving and wonderful talk. Very heartfelt, and I really wish we could speak under better circumstances and all that, but I think you laid it out very clearly. I ordered the book, but haven't read it, but I look forward very much to reading the book. I have a question about maybe a broader context of this, because a lot of this resonates to some degree, even though this is sort of clearly an extreme case, with sort of UNESCO preservation and the relationship between nation state and its sort of heritage industry rights. And, you know, that was created in the 70s. And so there's a sort of long run up of nations looking for their heritage, right? And fabricating them, restoring them, pretending they exist or don't exist, and so forth like that, in a very global way. How is there? Did you explore any of that, or is that something just hovering around somewhere? I'm just putting that out there a little bit.
So in my work, I'm basically looking at statist archaeological intervention in the way they produce knowledge. And that has been my intentionality in the book and my subsequent work that I do now. I'm very interested in is how knowledge is produced. So I do not investigate the relationship of how heritage politics work in India. That's not part of my scholarly work, but I do have a very good clue of what happens. So India, for instance, the Indian state has actively, what's the right word, actively worked with UNESCO to create a lot of heritage sites in India, Taj Mahal being one of them. And every few years, new heritage sites are declared UNESCO monuments, which I think is really good, because once you have it declared as UNESCO monuments, any kind of destruction will produce a massive global fury, hopefully, which is probably not always the case. And knowing what has happened earlier, for example, when the Bamiyan Buddhas were destroyed by the Taliban, even the global fury didn't make any difference. So we don't know any kind of global fury will make any difference in India. But I think having a UNESCO heritage stamp is very useful for the life of that monument. And there are a number of Muslim monuments in India which have UNESCO stamp, which I think is very good. However, what has happened in India now, and I was telling to Fahad and other earlier, is what I don't have much empirical evidence for that because it has not been, they're not data that is coming out, but there seems like a kind of an unsaid policy to let Muslim monuments, especially minor Muslim monuments, which earlier would have been protected by the Archaeological Survey of India or the state organization, are now left to ruination. So money is not being poured in to preserve those sites. For instance, if you go to Delhi, you will see a number of these minor Muslim monuments all over the city. Earlier, they were a very strong rule to prevent encroachment into the heritage site. But over the last 10 years, we have seen that there is an unsaid policy to allow encroachment unheeded, specifically in Muslim sites in North India. So there are a number of Muslim sites, especially the minor sites, they are slowly disappearing, mostly because the state doesn't think it is important to preserve them. Here I just want to say something else, is that this is something that has what I would call, this might sound a little too, it's the Pakistanification of Hindu sites in Pakistan. So a number of Hindu sites, like Pakistan had a large group of Hindu sites, which over the last 70 years have been left to ruins by an unsaid policy within the state of Pakistan Archaeological Department, is to not preserve Hindu sites. And I think that is what the present Hindutva-centric Indian state is trying to do, is that we will, because demolishing something like Babri Masjid, what we did with Babri Masjid, which will produce a lot of, what should I say, media attention. So the best thing is to just let them die on their own. And this has happened in Pakistan with Hindu sites, and this is what is happening in India today.
So thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I have a question related to this deliberate ruination of Islamic monuments. I assume that many of these monuments are tied in waqf or trust, Islamic trust, so they are supposed to be self-preserving through the waqf revenues. So does the Indian state interfere within this supposedly closed circuit of self-preservation through waqf?
So the waqf also does not preserve all the sites. So it's like they also have their own politics of preservation. Some of these minor Muslim sites are really outside of habitation, and they are slowly disappearing really fast. Sites which have waqf's proprietorial relationship has been weakened recently with the laws, the waqf laws being changed in India. So we are moving into a direction where Muslim heritage in India is endangered unambiguously. Yeah.
Partially a response to Mark's question. So the ASI is the, as the authorized guardian of archaeological sites and preservation in India, actually is a major player in UNESCO, in setting UNESCO norms. So it has sort of aggressively, like every other sort of international negotiation on climate, etc. I mean, it sort of sets out the stakes of the Indian state within sort of the broaching and the negotiation of international mandates. And if it has often used the sort of the post-colonial ressentiment as a kind of way of playing spoiler, precisely to sort of forbid international oversight of third world countries. And while it, on the other hand, claims legitimacy to do with its own sites as it wishes. So there's a kind of a complicated story there. Ashish, I mean, I think I feel like the tendency of your talk was to, which you also know is not true, was to sort of somehow portray that all such claims are false, right? I mean, and there is the fact that, I mean, what makes this a particular can of worms is that there were demolitions, but of not only Hindu structures. I mean, there's Muslim on Muslim, there's Hindu on Hindu, there's all kinds. So in other words, the pre-modern world is full of destructions. You could say destructions of all sites, which are linked to also political acts, lesson setting for a population, etc. And so it is the case that in Gyanvapi there is some substance to this, right? In Ayodhya we know that's not the case. So the fact is that sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not, which sort of then allows a kind of everything to be. But in both cases, strangely, I mean, in Ayodhya the science is being asked to prove this, where we actually, I mean, there's a kind of mismatch in the legal documents from the period. And so in the case of Kashi, we know that there's a farman from Aurangzeb saying, do this. In the case of the Babri Masjid, there's no legal record whatsoever. So you mentioned this kind of, the sort of correspondence of legal evidence to sort of material evidence. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Okay, so I consider myself, this might sound a little weird, but I'm an empirical fascist. So I really, as an archaeologist, I am very, very interested in an empirical, factual evidence. And that is something very, very important for me as an archaeologist. For instance, I will say this is a plastic bottle which has water, but you have to give me more evidence to say that this was drunk by Ashish here. And I think that is something very important. And if you look at the way archaeological theory has been framed in the last nearly 150 years, it has a very strong semblance to juridical relationship to empirical evidence. And there is a very clear distinction between, in archaeological theory now, between empirical evidence and interpretative narrative. And when contemporary reports are written, it's very often those distinctions are very clearly made. That there's something, we can say something empirical of this room, table, chair, so on and so forth. And then we can say something interpretative about this space. Now, it is in this liminal space that Hindutva archaeology works. Is that you're right about Gyanvapi, that there's a Farman, but we don't know what was the material, empirical nature, what really happened. It's that ambiguity. And I think what the Hindutva the Hindutva figures who are making something like this are exploiting this ambivalence in an extraordinary way. So what they have done, and is that what they have learned from Ayodhya is that first you create a narrative of dispute, which may or may not have any empirical relationship. So you create a narrative dispute. Then, as we have seen in Gyanvapi, we have seen it in Mathura, we have seen it in Sambhal, and we have seen in a few other places, you involve Archaeological Survey of India through a juridical intervention. And the Archaeological Survey of India then enters in this disputed, murky, ambivalent space to produce a certain scientific narrative, which is then exploited by the Hindutva activist to create a much more dominant narrative, which was earlier a figment of a certain imagination. Now, for me, I think, as I said in the paper earlier, we know historically that pre-modern India was not a peaceful space in any sense. Temples, mosques, settlements were all vulnerable location, architectural location, which were often destroyed. They were often abandoned, left to ruination. We know that. In archaeological record, we see that constantly, a lot of evidence of ruination and abandonment. The problem happens is that there is very difficult, especially when you're excavating and we find a material culture which is damaged, to suggest if that damage is a product of abandonment or if the damage is a product of destruction. We need more empirical evidence for that. In most cases in archaeology, we do not find that evidence. For instance, again, if I leave this laptop for about 30 years in this room, it will be very difficult for anybody to say if it was abandoned or it was broken. Because that is the nature of how material culture degrade. So in Indian context, in South Asian context, it has generally been very difficult for us to get good empirical evidence to show that a particular architectural remain or a material fragment has been purposefully destroyed. It has been very difficult for us to show. There have been only those cases we know is that when we have a non-archaeological evidence in the form of a firman or something like that. But archaeologically, it has been extraordinarily difficult to show empirically. Right,
I think we have just enough time for one short question and a short response. Anyone wants? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. Really enlightening. Really interesting. I guess my question is more not surrounding the archaeological manifestation of what we just discussed, but rather the underlying political underpinnings of what's happening, right? So what we see in these images, what we see in a lot of the stuff that you spoke about is, we can say that it's a sort of a, a material archaeological manifestation of an underlying political ideology that's very, very prevalent here in India right now. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on, and again, I mean, this is less to do with what's happened, it's more to do with, moving forward. I'm curious about your thoughts on where you see the future of ASI's political ideology evolving, given not the, the specific instances of archaeological sites being declared as disputed, but rather the sort of larger ideological paradigm that sets what the ASI should or should not be doing.
So what I try to show in my book is that Archaeological Survey of India is overwhelming a bureaucratic organization. It's like most bureaucracy in India, corrupt, adulterated, if I can use that word, compromised, where individuals, either they are archaeologists or they are clerks or they're any other staff, they're all in a existing and surviving in a highly hierarchical and an oppressive bureaucratic system where most of them are barely trying to survive. And what I try to show in my book are these archaeologists who are really, it's difficult being a bureaucrat archaeologist in India. Bureaucratically, I think ASI's trajectory will remain the same as the way it is. Ideologically, it is shifting, mostly because the kind of younger archaeologists who are joining or who are getting recruited have certain degrees of ideological persuasion. The term that we use for some of these archaeologists is what we call Bhagwa archaeologist or saffron archaeologist. And yes, ASI is slowly transforming into a saffron organization. That is my assessment. Will it change? I mean, it also depends on the nature of does BJP remain in India in the future or not? So there's a lot of other factors involved. But generally, I think ASI is moving to a saffron direction. I'm sorry, my assessment is not optimistic.
That's our first talk. Thank you so much, Ashish, for coming all the way. And our next talk for HTC Forum lectures is on 13th of November, same time, 6 p.m. in this room. And we'll have Bisera Pincheva, who is going to talk about acoustics and sound as a way of doing architectural history. So please come, and thank you so much for supporting us and coming here and engaging with us for the first talk. Thank you. Have a good night.